In this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the strategies and concepts that come into play in high-level Puyo matches, so that you can have an idea of, if you're watching matches or videos of matches, you can have an idea of what the players are doing and why they're doing it and what the strategies they're using are. So, the main point of the game is pretty obvious. You're just trying to build one really big chain, and you want your chain to be bigger than your opponent's chain, and if it is, then you're going to win. So this is an example of just a really big chain match, where both players build up one really big main chain, and then they both send it, and then whoever's is bigger wins. So in competitive matches, you don't see really big matches as often because it's hard to build up because the other player might send garbage to you and make you fill up while you're trying to make a big chain. But sometimes they do happen. And then Alf's chain here was worth 136,000 points, which is really big because usually just 100,000 points is a really big match, and you don't see that very often. So 136,000 is crazy. And part of the reason why it was so big is because not only was it a 15 chain, but there were a lot of Puyo disappearing together. So the 14th match was 8 of the same color disappearing together, and that's a really big bonus. And then the 15th match was 6 of the same color disappearing together. So when you get the same color pieces, or a lot of them connecting together and disappearing together at the end of the match, it's a pretty big bonus. So a lot of the game is just building up a big main chain, but there's more to it than that, because while you're building up, you can attack and then also defend with smaller harassment chains. So when you're attacking, you can send a smaller amount of garbage that hits faster and then makes your opponent fill up. But there's one other thing as well. So the big idea is that if you send your main chain really early, then you're usually at a disadvantage because your opponent has a lot of time to build a bigger chain than you. So another goal of attacking your opponent is to get them to send their main chain, and then when they do that, you have a lot of time and you can build a bigger chain and then win. Now that's a lot harder than I'm making it sound, but the really strong players can do it pretty well, so that's the strategy that most players are trying to employ. So, to beat that, when someone sends garbage to you, you want to counter it instead of just sending your main chain. And what I mean by counter is you make a match that's just a little bit bigger than the one that your opponent sends. So now you're sending the garbage back with a little bit more without sending your main chain. And if you can't counter it, but you don't want to send your main chain, you can also receive the garbage well, so that you can dig through it and get rid of it all, and then still have your Puyo left over and have your main chain left over. So I'm going to show some examples of that here. So in this video, player 2 sends an attack and player 1 can't defend it, but they do build up so they can receive it well. And then, after receiving the garbage, they can send an attack of their own and clear most of the garbage. Now player 2 is able to draw enough pieces to be able to play their main chain, but like I've been saying, playing your main chain first is often a disadvantage because it gives the opponent a lot of time to build a bigger chain, which is what happens here. And in this match as well, we'll see player 1 sends an attack here that's pretty small. Player 2 counters it, but then player 1 sends a counter to that counter without sending their main chain. Now player 2 counters that with their main chain, but that chain takes a lot of time, and during the time, player 1's able to build a bigger chain and win. Now, in order to do all that countering, you have to know how much your opponent is sending, and at the high level, you can't just look over when you hear them make a match, because at that point it's usually too late. You want to know how much your opponent might send and how much they can defend with the pieces they have on their screen right now, and so you can know when you should attack them or what you have to be ready for. And the only way to do this is by watching your opponent's screen while playing. And if you want to see something really impressive, player 1 is Momoken, who is essentially the best Puyo player in the world, and the red dot shows where he's looking on the screen. So his side is the one-player side, but he's spending most of his time looking at player 2's side, just so he can know, like, what is their form and how much they can send and how much they can defend against, so he knows like what he needs to be prepared for or when he can attack and get an advantage. So here you can see like he doesn't have anything to counter a 2 chain, so he can send a 2 chain and get an advantage. And then you can see, okay, looks like a 2 chain is coming up, but he can send a bigger 2 chain than that and get a bigger advantage. So at the really high level, this is what's happening a lot. Like, both players are watching each other's screen a lot and trying to counter what it is that the opponent is like doing, and then try to find weaknesses in their form and all of that. Now some other concepts are you can use too much while you're attacking. So I've been saying a lot that you don't want to send your main chain, but if your opponent sends an attack that's too big, then it's okay to counter it with your main chain, because if they use up too many of their pieces, even though they have a lot of time, it won't be enough time to build a bigger chain than yours if yours is big enough. Then another concept is second chains, which is where, so let's say you send your main chain first, and then the opponent uses the time to build a bigger chain than you. If it's not too much bigger than yours, then you can use the time while their main chain is going to build a second chain. And second chains are weaker than the first chains because you don't have pieces to start with. Like, when you build your main chain, you have a lot of time. You just start the match and you have as much time as you need to build up. But for the second chain, you only have as much time as the player's main chain goes. But for an example of a second chain, here player 1 sends their main chain, and then player 2 takes the time to build up a bigger main chain. And they successfully build a bigger main chain, but now player 1 has time to build a second chain. So if player 2's main chain isn't that much bigger than player 1's main chain, then they can counter the garbage they receive with their second chain. So here their second chain is big enough to counter that, and they end up winning the match. Now you could also have alternate starting points for your chain, or like an emergency chain where your opponent's sending something and you have to counter it or you're gonna lose. but you aren't drawing the pieces you need to start your main chain in the way you want to. So, for an example of that,
序盤からあんまりなんか速攻みたいなのはないですね。
here player 1's going to send a 2 double chain. Now, player 2's match is meant to start with the red pieces here, and then go through the purples, and then the yellows, and then the blue. But they weren't going to draw the 2 red pieces they needed in time. They only had 1. So instead, they were able to start their chain at a different point with the yellows and counter the garbage that way. And then player 1 wasn't able to draw the 3 red pieces they needed to play their bigger main chain. And for another example, player 2's chain here looks like it was probably meant to start on the left side, so you clear these Puyo and then hit the green one, and then the purple, and then the blue, and then the yellow. But when player 1 sends their main chain, instead they're able to find a different way to start the chain on the right side when they don't draw the green piece. And they just barely counter it, but player 1 ends up winning anyway. Now another thing that happens very often in the high level matches is the players are making these like attacking setups, but instead of actually using them to attack, they see the opponent has a counter for them, so they instead use the pieces that they're going to use to attack in their main chain instead. And on the other side, players also have pieces in their main chain, but then they like break their main chain so that they can attack or defend with those pieces instead. And for an example of that, here player 2 sends a really big 2 double chain, and then player 1, instead of playing their main chain, they counter it like this. So with the pieces that they're drawing a green and a yellow and a green and a purple. If they wanted to, they could have put it like this and sent their main chain. But like I've been saying, usually you're at a disadvantage when you send your main chain. So instead of doing that, what they did was make their match like this, and then with the 3 purples there, the match broke. So instead of a main chain, it was a counter 3 chain. So the players are doing that a lot, where they have pieces that they could either they could use it to make a bigger main chain, or they could use it to break their main chain to send a counter or attack or defend or things like that. And then one more concept I want to mention is all clear matches. So when a player gets an all clear, then their next match is worth a large bonus. So after you get an all clear, you have this all clear sign, and that means that the next match you make is going to send like 5 lines, even if it's just a single match. So in an all clear match, the players usually build really high on one side, so that if the other player makes a single match and sends like 5 lines of garbage, you have a form that can receive the garbage and counter it. So here you can see that single match sent a red piece, which is 5 lines, but then player 2 also made a single match, and then it became even again. So that's all I have for that. And then the next part is tips and techniques for actual play. So at just the really easy level, or I guess I shouldn't say really easy because even this isn't actually very easy. But for the more basic, like just playing safe, some strategies are just keeping your main chain accessible or building a counter. Building a counter is usually better, but it's generally easier just to focus on like building a main chain instead. And you want to make sure your main chain is like accessible, and you don't have to take and you don't want to take too many like unnecessary risks. So in this setup, your main chain is going to be like this. So this is how you're looking to start your chain and how your chain is going to look when it finishes. But if you're drawing these pieces, maybe to make it bigger, you put them like this. And then you just need like 3 greens and a yellow, and now your chain's bigger. But the problem with doing this is that if you needed to make a chain, there's like no chains you can make unless you draw exactly like a red and a blue. But um, besides that, you can't really do much unless you draw 3 green pieces and a yellow piece. And if you're trying to draw that in a hurry, usually you're not going to draw the 3 green pieces and the yellow piece that you need. You have to be pretty lucky to get that. So if your opponent like attacked you right at this point, then you probably wouldn't be able to deal with it and you just lose. So instead of doing that, you could do it like this. It's the exact same pieces and the same idea. You still want to get 3 green pieces and a yellow piece to make your chain bigger. But if your opponent were to attack you, and you wanted to send your main chain, not only could you send it by getting 3 green pieces and a yellow, you could also send it with just a single blue piece, or you could send it with a single yellow piece. So now, pretty much, no matter what you draw, you'll have a way to send your main chain in a hurry if you need to. So just by knowing some things like that, like instead of putting the pieces like this, if you put the pieces like this instead, it makes your main chain more accessible. Just by knowing things like that, you can make sure you can keep your main chain like more easily accessible so that if someone sends garbage, um, you'll have a way to still play your main chain in a hurry. Now another idea is that in order to counter garbage, you can just build 1 or 2 tall columns. So if you can't play your main chain or play a counter chain, you can just build 1 or 2 tall columns so that you're able to receive the garbage and then dig back down to your pieces or play your main chain after you receive the garbage. So if your form's like this, you can see this column is really tall, so even if a lot of garbage falls like this, you can still access it, and then when you play the match, it'll dig down and then make your main chain. Now when you get better, a lot of the times it's better to not actually connect it to the main chain, so because of the idea I was talking about before, where usually you're at a disadvantage if you play your main chain first, so it can be better to like leave off the Puyo. But just for the idea of countering garbage without actually making a match, this shows one way of doing that. Now you can also build counter chains, which are meant to like receive garbage and then you start the chain. So here's a really tall counter chain, and each group of garbage sends 5 lines, so someone could send 5 lines and then 5 lines, and then there could be more garbage coming. But if your piece has a red Puyo attached to it, you can start your chain, and it's a really big main chain. So you can receive a whole bunch of garbage and still counter it. And then there's different ways and different forms of building counters like this. But the idea is that you build a couple of columns really tall so that when the garbage falls, you can access the pieces at the top of the column to start a match. And one other thing is that you can build. Oh wait, that's that's what I just went through. You can build counter main chains that are really tall, and your main chain starts with a piece that's really high up. So when you receive the garbage, you can play your main chain. Now, some tips for attacking are if you're trying to get really good, you want to try to attack without ruining your form. So you want to attack but still have like a main chain left over that you can play. And you also want to aim for two double chains, which are where you send a two chain, but the second match is a double match. So that's what's called a two double. There's also like three double, which is a three chain, and the third match is a double match, or like two triple, which would be a two chain with a triple match. And then short and powerful chains are the best, which is why I'd recommend aiming for like two double chains at first. Because if you send a longer chain or a weaker chain, it gives your opponent more time to react, or it's not as powerful and it's easy for them to just receive the garbage and not really be affected. Now, if you're having trouble like figuring out how to make a two double chain while you're playing, you can start off with just form specific attacks. And by that I mean if you always use a certain form, like this is GTR, there's ways to find in that form you can find a way to create a two double chain. So here is an example of how you might do that with GTR. When the blues disappear, it makes a two double. And an advantage of building like form specific attacks is that you can also know how to not use them as an attack and build up from them. So for example, if you did this instead, now instead of a two double, you send your main chain. So you can always set up this like two double if you get the right pieces, and then you might notice, or like your opponent might notice you always do this, so then they're ready and they send like a four chain or they send their main chain thinking that you're going to do this. But if they do that, then you can just like send your main chain instead. Now here's another example of a form-specific attack. So if you use a form like this, if you draw the right pieces, then you can build up like this and send a really big attack like this. Or if you don't want to send the attack, you can just make a bigger main chain on the right side. And you can build up. And you can also like not do the attack or do a smaller attack. So with whatever form you use, you can figure out your own ways of making like a pretty consistent attack and setting it up and then deciding whether or not you want to use the attack or just build up. The problem with form-specific attacks are that you need to draw the right pieces, and sometimes you just don't draw those pieces. So it's harder to be flexible with the pieces you're drawing, but it's still really strong, and it's a strategy that's easier to start with. Also, if you build flat, you usually have more options for attacking. So if you build like really uneven like this, it's hard to attack anywhere. Sometimes you can build attacks on the right side, but then it's hard to like make a good chain. But if you instead build more flat like this, you usually have more space to work with. So now we're going to talk about flexible attacking and defending. And by that I mean having a lot of options where you either like send a different size chain or you can send your main chain. But based on how your pieces are set up, you can choose one or the other and you're not locked into anything. So a really important concept is just leaving off a key Puyo. And it's also not too hard to do, but it requires that you remember that key Puyo later on. So by leaving off a key Puyo, I mean not putting a piece that you need to play your main chain. So here you need a green piece to play your main chain. But if you don't put it and leave it off, it'll be a smaller chain instead. So with just that green piece, everything disappears. But when it's not there, when you leave it off, the chain doesn't go that far. Now that's actually something that's really good, and it's something you want to try to do, because let's say you put I guess I'll go without the green piece first. You have a lot of different options here. If you draw a yellow piece, you could send a 5 chain, which usually isn't that good, but maybe your opponent sends like a 4 chain and you want to counter it with a 5 chain. If you use a red piece, you can play a 4 chain. And if you use a green piece, you can play a 3 chain. So you have a lot of options, and also if your opponent sends like their main chain, then all you have to do is remember to place that key green piece here, and then you can send your main chain. So that's why you have a lot of options. But if you put that key green piece there to start with, like if it's already there, then all of your options go away, because if you start the yellows, it's going to connect your whole chain. And if you start the reds, that's your whole chain as well. And the greens, it's the same thing. So if you put that piece there, then you just can't really do anything for attacking or defending unless you find a different way to break your chain. But if you leave it off, then you have a lot of different options. So that's why, like, even in other forms like this, let's say you didn't have these red pieces here. It's usually a really good idea to try to like leave off a key piece somewhere so that you can make a smaller match instead of just being locked into making your main chain. So another way to be able to think more flexibly is to look at the starting like a group of Puyo on the left side or on the right side, or alternating between like top and middle, which is something I talked about in the last video. And so I'll show some examples of that. This is an interesting shape because if you played the red pieces on the left side, it's a 2 double attack, which is pretty strong. But you're not locked into that attack because if you play the green piece on the right side, it sends your main chain. So one way of being flexible is to really try to look at both the left side and the right side. So for example, not only could you play the red pieces, if you drew 3 blue pieces and put them on the left side, you could make a 4 chain. And if you wanted to send a 5 chain, you could like add green pieces here. And if you want to send your main chain, you could send it with the green pieces like I showed before. So by looking at both the left side and the right side, you can be more flexible with how much you're going to send. Now here's another example where it looks pretty obvious what you're going to do here, right? You put this and then you send like a really big attack. But you don't actually have to do that. So, if you wanted to, you could do something more like this. And now when you put a yellow piece, wait. Sorry. When you put a blue piece, instead of being a really big 2-chain, I forgot a green. It's actually a long main chain. So here it's a 7-chain instead. So it's good if you're able to find ways to be flexible and you want to try to like build big attacks, but not necessarily use them, and instead find ways to um, incorporate that attack into your main chain and build a bigger main chain off of it. Finally, if you form a lot of connected groups of 3, then it usually makes it easier to be flexible or to have a lot of attack options. So this has a lot of groups of 3, and if you put a green piece, you could send like a 2 double attack, or if you put a yellow piece, that would be a weak 2-chain, but if you put a red piece on top, it would be a 3-chain. And you could also go on the right side, like put a red and a green piece and have a 2 double that way. So by having a lot of different groups of 3, it's easy to be flexible and send a lot of different attacks or build a lot of different defenses as well. Now when you're not like a real pro at the game, you might not be able to watch your opponent's screen as much as like momoken here. But you can still try to pay attention to your opponent's screen at like key points in time. So if you're not really going to look at all, one strategy that you can use against someone who's able to like attack and then build a bigger chain than you when you send your main chain, a strategy you can use is to hold on to a 3 or a 4 chain for defense, and that really goes back to the idea of leaving off a key Puyo here. So instead of like just building one really big main chain, you leave off a key Puyo so that you'll have like a 3 or a 4 chain ready to counter an attack. And then you can also glance over just like before you make moves that are going to leave you vulnerable for a while. So like a situation like this, maybe you want to put this green and this red like this so you can make the GTR shape. But that's going to leave you vulnerable because you have no other matches you can make, and you're going to have to draw 3 green pieces before you can make your main chain. And a lot of the times you're not going to be able to draw 3 green pieces that quickly. So when you have the green and the red piece, before you put it down, you can glance over at your opponent's screen, and if they have something that looks like this, then maybe you don't want to put it down. Or if they have something that looks like this, maybe you should wait before you put it down and then try to like put it over here instead. And then all you need is 1 red piece to start the main chain instead of 3 green pieces. Now another good time to try to look over at your opponent's screen if you can't always look over at their screen, and I'd say most people can't do that, is a good time to look is right before you send an attack. So, um, let's say you're like thinking about sending this 2 double attack. Well, right before you send it, you can look over and then try to see, does it look like they have a counter chain to my attack? Because if they do, you don't want to send your attack. So you can try to look and see, does it look like they're going to counter or send a bigger attack than I'm going to send them? And if so, then you should hold off on your attack. Finally, just one tip is that when you're thinking about where to put a piece, you want to hold it over the highest column just in case you need to you want to put it on top of that column or put it past that column, because if you don't have it over the highest column, then it falls down farther than that, then you can't get it back up there if you need to get it up there. Now I'm going to talk about some ways to cover your weaknesses. So your main chain doesn't always have to be easy to reach, because you can have a counter chain ready instead. So for an example of that, here your main chain is really hard to reach because you need 3 red pieces, 2 blue pieces, a yellow piece, and a green piece. So that's a lot of different pieces, and uh, you're usually not going to draw that in a hurry. But the reason why this is okay here is because if someone sends a 2 double or a 3 double, you can defend against it with just a single green piece, like this. So even though you can't really start your main chain easily, it's okay because you have a counter chain anyway. So it's hard for your opponent to attack, and if the opponent instead sends a really long chain, you'll have a lot of time to draw all the pieces you need to make your own chain. So that's one interesting idea, that you don't always have to be able to access your main chain. You just have to have a defensive chain or a counter chain, like a 3 or a 4 chain or a big 2 chain ready, and then you also have to be able to build up and make your main chain if your opponent sends their main chain. Something else you can do is make reversible chains that can start in either in multiple places or on both sides. So this looks like a normal GTR form, or maybe not exactly normal, but it looks kind of hard because you need to draw yellow pieces, and then you need a blue piece, and then you need a green piece, and then you start it with a red piece. Oops. You actually need 2 green pieces. So you need so many different specific pieces, it looks like you're never going to be able to start your main chain in a hurry. But this is actually a reversible chain, where if you played it on the right side, it still makes a main chain. And you could commit to playing it on the right side and then use the left side as the tell. So sometimes when you make a reversible chain, you don't necessarily have to decide which way you want to make your chain um, immediately, but you can change based on the colors you draw. And this is something you can do to confuse your opponent, where maybe you use GTR pretty much every match, so they look over and they think, well, now you can't make your GTR because there's so many different colors you need, and they might just send a 3 chain or a 4 chain thinking that you're not going to get the colors you need, but you really only need one color. Now for some final tips. once you're at a high enough level, you only want to defend with your main chain as a last resort when you have nothing else left, unless you think your opponent's using too much when they attack. So, if your opponent uses like a whole bunch of pieces when they attack and they don't have many pieces left, or if your main chain is just really good and your opponent's main chain doesn't look that good, then maybe it's okay to use your main chain. You also want to attack when your opponent can't defend, which sounds obvious, but in order to know that, that means you have to be like looking at the opponent's screen enough to see when they don't have any matches they can really make. And the easiest thing to see is when they like don't really have any groups of three anywhere. So if they have something like this, there's no groups of three there, so they can't even make like a two chain unless they draw specific pieces. So you want to try to attack when your opponent doesn't have any good way to defend it. You also want to try to counter your opponent's counters, so you don't want to attack into them. And my point here is something that I mentioned before where like maybe you have this two double attack, which is a good attack, like a good attack to use in general, but if the opponent has a bigger thing ready, like this is going to send 38 pieces of garbage, where your two double attack is only going to send 13. So if you send your two double into someone who has this really big three double ready and waiting, you're probably going to lose. So that's why you you want to see like, okay, my opponent has like a three double counter or a three double attack ready. I don't want to send a two double. I want to make my attack bigger or make a counter to their attack and try to send like something like this so that oops I forgot a color, but you want to try to make a bigger attack so you don't lose. You can also try some combination attacks where instead of just always sending like a two double, you can try to send a single match first, which will send a little bit of garbage, or single matches can actually be really powerful. Like a single match like this sends a lot more than you probably would expect, like 22 pieces of garbage with just one match. So that's really fast and really powerful. But even if you don't have a single match that's as powerful as that, like let's say you have something like this, you have this three chain ready and waiting to attack with. But like I said before, it's usually not a good idea to send like a weak longer chain, so like a really weak three chain, and it's usually not that good to send a really weak two chain. It depends on who you're playing against, and maybe if they have a weakness or if they just don't know how to counter what you're going to send, then it can be okay at times to send like it's a really small two chain or a really small three chain. But in general, you don't want to just send a small three chain. So here, something you could try instead is put it like this, and now you make a single match that sends four pieces of garbage, and there's actually this, the way points work is, when you put down pieces quickly, you get points while you're holding down, and then those points build up to your next attack. So if you put down all of these pieces, usually you're going to have a lot of bonus points stored up, and this will send actually like more like one line and a couple garbage pieces, so it'll be even stronger because of that. So you can make this, and then that might cover whatever the opponent had to counter your three chain with, and then you send the three chain after and just win. So sometimes trying combination attacks where you send like a fast attack first and then a slower and more powerful attack after can work really well. Finally, you don't want to attack when you're behind in pieces or when your form is poor, because like unless you see a weakness. So when you're behind in pieces, your opponent just has more pieces, and um, if that's the case, they usually have a lot of ways to win, where any attack is going to be using too many Puyo for you because they have more pieces, so they could just send their main chain, and you aren't going to have enough time to put down all of the pieces you need to put down to build a bigger chain. And if your form is poor, then when you attack, the opponent can just send their main chain, and you won't be able to make your form good enough to make a bigger chain than them. So that's all I have for concepts, but there are a couple of interesting matches I found in this video that I want to look at. I'd say all of these matches were pretty good, but let's see what this was. Oh. This one was just momoken on the right side, and the title was like, when you think the GTR shape blew up, it becomes GTR anyway. So this is the GTR shape, and it doesn't look like there's any way to make it, but somehow it falls and it's GTR anyway. I thought that was really funny. Oh, this chain was also really impressive, where it looks like it's supposed to go through these pieces, but there's no blue piece here. So what it looks like is something like this. So the blue piece connects, and then the whole chain goes. But if you're watching closely, the blue piece disappears, so now it looks like the match is going to happen, so that's what player 2 sees. It looks like the match is going to stop right here. But instead, somehow the match goes on like this. And then one last one was, I was saying it's usually not good to send like weak 2 chains or weak 3 chains, and here's a reason for that. So here player 2 is sending a really weak 3 chain, while after the player starts the match, player 1 plays a really strong 2 chain, and before player 2 can even draw their next piece, they already received the garbage and filled up. So that doesn't happen very often, but that's the idea of why you like don't really want to play weak and longer chains. So that's all I have for this video, and I hope it's interesting or useful.